your culture, especially in a paleo world, your culture tells you what's important. It tells you what kind of values to hold, what it means to be part of the cosmos. All of these things come through the story and the culture. And that's great. But what's happened more recently is that now our cultural narrative, especially in the West, especially with this technological civilization that we've built, it looks like our cultural narrative is coming to an end.
Welcome to the Culture Club, conversations on physical culture. Well, welcome.
Glad to be here.
Frank, the exuberant animal, is in the house. What does an exuberant animal do during these times of shelter in place?
Oh, it's a little bit frustrating, especially, I do some writing and, I spend plenty of time on the computer like everybody else, but I'm here in Bend, Oregon, and the weather's been fantastic this spring. So I've got just light pouring into my office, and it's pretty tough to stay, focused on the keyboard when it's like that. So I go out a lot.
Definitely. It's been a warm, sunny day here in the Bay Area, and it's hard to stay indoors when it's like that. But we do what we can to kind of balance the intellectual with the physical pursuits.
Yeah.
There's this idea of, the human animal. And I first encountered this as the thought experiment of the zoo human, or the human zoo, depending on how you look at it. Where the modern world has put us in this strange sort of predicament. And you write a little bit about how humans are, the title of your website, The Exuberant Animal, for starters, puts that frame around it. But you talk about this idea of the mismatch. How do you think about that? What is the mismatch?
Well, that's fundamental to understanding the human body, because what I always start with is big history, and I look at the scope of history in general, the history of the cosmos, and then the smaller section, big human history, which is at least 300,000 years, but more like 6 to 7 million. And you've got this big expanse of time, and then you've got agriculture and civilization in just only the last fraction of a second, really. So our normal state is as animals living in a wild, natural, outdoor environment. And that's the status quo. That is normal. And so within the blink of an eye, we've got civilization, we've got agriculture, and now technology. And it's come across so quickly that now we are, in effect, living in an alien environment. And that's the mismatch. And that's the place I think we need to begin when we're having conversations about the state of the body.
Right.
We're in this really difficult position right now.
And you've sort of carved your own path to where you are now. You mentioned that you're in Bend, Oregon. Is that your residence year-round?
It is currently, yeah. I was in Central Washington for a while and Seattle for a while. Grew up in California. That was very formative for me because growing up in the Bay Area, I had lots of nature experiences available to me. I went to Yosemite quite a bit, but did a lot of rock climbing there. So that was very formative. And Can
I ask, where did you grow up in California?
In Mountain View, California, in the Bay Area.
Okay, so not too far from where I'm doing this interview. I grew up in Marin County, and I've lived in the East Bay for most of the last 10 years or so. So it's definitely kind of a mecca for nature and outdoor activities. But you've taken it to a different level, I think, with what you have created around this idea of the exuberant animal, and you offer some of these kind of outback experiences. That's in your own backyard, correct?
Right. Well, that's whenever we can organize something like that. So I've been to a lot of academic conferences and corporate conferences, and I find them just really sterile and really deadening for my spirit, the animal spirit. Typically, they're in a hotel conference room, and they're just horrible. So my idea with these outback conferences is to organize outdoor as possible conferences where people can come and do continuing education. And that's a really exciting idea because that's where we learn the best.
So you're kind of talking about, say, a conference that might be dealing with the subject of health and fitness, or even ancestral health, evolutionary fitness, yet it's in this sort of artificial, sterile environment where the medium doesn't quite match the message.
Right. Yes, I've been to actually quite a few conferences where the delivery is very Cartesian. So, in other words, the professor gets up and has this grip on the lectern or the podium and delivers this disembodied presentation where the body's really not involved at all. It's just a string of language, and it might actually be a good presentation in that sense, but it's nowhere near holistic. So my goal in everything really is to draw a circle, and that means getting the body involved in presentation.
You know, you're making me think. I need to move my computer a little bit further back, and I'm going to move my chair back here just so that I'm a little bit more embodied. I'm not just the talking head. I like how I can see some of your body. It makes you come to life in a way that a lot of these Zoom presentations and things, we lose that element. I think you were just on another Zoom conference call. What was that about?
That was with Dr. Paul Ehrlich, who is famous for his population studies, and he's been an environmentalist for 50 years or more. And so that was a perfect Earth Day kind of theme to be talking about, and that was fun.
Wow, yeah, Paul Ehrlich. That's a big name in those circles. I think I first came across his ideas maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and then kind of randomly I saw his name on as a blurb on the back of Esther Goklay's book about back pain. I guess he used some of Esther Goklay. I don't know if you've used her methods at all, but she's primarily looking at posture and how it relates to back pain. And she observed a lot of primal populations and how people naturally tend to walk upright, how they carry things on their head or in ways that are naturally more efficient. That was just kind of a small world thing. But speaking of which, because I know that that Esther Goklay has spent a lot of time in places like Africa, where some of these tribes are still relatively untouched by modern technology. I believe you've spent some time in Africa as well.
Right. Yeah, I went several times, and I spent a little bit of time with the Hadza Bushmen in Tanzania, and then the Kalahari Bushmen in Botswana. And it's not like I lived with them or anything, but I was able to go out with them and get a little bit of the flavor of what their life was like at some point. So very exciting, very, very exciting.
Less of a mismatch maybe between their environment and
Oh,
their physiology.
absolutely. I mean, their bodies are doing what they evolved to do. And the thing I always say is that every detail of our anatomy and physiology and psychology is the way it is because of this vast experience in wild outdoor environments. So we are tuned by nature to absorb the qualities of nature, and that's what we do best. So it doesn't come as any big surprise that we're having so much trouble now with the modern human body because we're living in a place that we just do not synchronize with.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that, you know, for all of the experts and attention and, you know, rigorous thinking that goes into the modern medical establishment and the experts on health and fitness, how they really have failed us, or maybe we failed ourselves. I think that to put all of the responsibility on an institution is kind of to absolve ourselves from the responsibility. But this is where we do have the opportunity in small groups to come together and figure it out, and hopefully bring back some of those elements. The main thrust of what I've been talking to people about on this podcast is the idea of sort of the gym or the community hub for being a place of reclaiming our health and our natural birthright. I practice natural movement, but there are a lot of different modalities that bring in the outdoor elements to some degree or another. Um, just in brief, how would you describe your approach? If you were, do you do sort of structured sessions of movement with people, or is it more of the whole exploration of ideas in these longer retreats?
Well, when I do a workshop, it's structured around a rhythm. And to make it as simple as possible, it's just a rhythm of presentation and movement. So over a typical 3-day session, we might do 10 lecture presentations and 10 movement sessions. And it's very exciting because by engaging in that rhythm, we keep our attention level really high and our energy level really high, and so we can get a lot out of each of those. And it's a really fun way to do it, as opposed to, say, going and doing 3 days of lecture, which would be just overwhelming, or 3 days of movement, which would be too much. So,
Mm-hmm.
and then plus what works in that rhythm is a lot of social time as well, and breaks too for rest. So it's, again, I'm always trying to draw the circle and make it as holistic as possible.
How do your values come into play and inform the kinds of presentations and then the kinds of movements that you introduce people to?
My values, well, I'm a pretty earth-centric person, and I'm really concerned about the state of the planet, and so that informs my value system. And so I'm really not shy about being an activist and pushing an activist philosophy, you might say. So for me, the body is essential in that. We got to keep our energy level high and our health in good condition so that we can continue on doing this kind of work that we need to be doing. So the body and health are fundamental to that. And it's not like a separate discipline over at the other end of campus. It's foundational to everything we do.
Right. I think that the nature of the sort of fitness industrial complex is pursuing health for its own sake, sort of as an end in itself, which in a way it is, but I think that there's a lot of power in the idea of being fit for something, for some purpose. And as you know, in the MoveNet school of thought, going back to George Hebert and the natural method, there's a slogan of "Be strong to be useful." But you have said maybe that's not the best way of framing it. Is there another way to think about what we might be strong for?
Be strong so you are resilient, because changing anything in this modern world, you're going to run up against conflict, you're going to run up against a lot of stress. So, the example I always heard out of MoveNet is, if you had to go into a burning building and pull somebody out, you would be able to do that because you would be physically strong. And that's
Oh,
fine.
just the other day, I was down the street doing that for my. No, I didn't.
Yeah, and that's all fine and good. I mean, that would be one example of being useful. But also the whole domain of changing the culture and changing politics and changing the way we live in the world, that's a demanding endeavor. And that's why we need our bodies to be working.
Yeah, I see the artwork over your left shoulder. Is that something that you did yourself?
Well, yes, and there's a story behind that, because when I was in massage school, it was a year-long program, and I would sit in class every night, and there was a big poster on the front of the classroom that was anatomical man. So the anatomical man, he doesn't have any skin on, and so there's this view and then this view, and there's no context. There's no life support system. And I spent the whole year looking at this thing and thinking, wow, that's so incomplete and it's so not holistic. So when I graduated and I got my massage license, this is one of the first things I did. I said, I'm going to revise the anatomical chart, and I'm going to put the life support ring around the human being. So that's where that came from.
I've been thinking a lot about the elements as stressors that have been in our environment ever since. I mean, we evolved under this kind of stress, whether it's the sun or the gravitational forces that keep us on the earth, the rocks that we're in contact with our feet, and the earth, the water, and the temperatures, the cold temperatures and the heat. So there's this idea of sort of all life evolving within this force field of stress that simultaneously supports us, but also constricts us in a way. And that word stress is like, I think it comes from stricture, which is, you think like to constrict. So how do we, I guess the question that I have is sort of, how do we find freedom within these stresses, using them to our advantage, and also maybe recognizing our limitations?
Well, the first thing to understand, I think, about paleo and the paleo stress, and it's usually presented this way, is that stress during the paleo was episodic. It might be acute, but then it would go away. So you go out on a hunt and you encounter a wild animal and you have this incredibly stressful experience, either killing an animal or being attacked by a wild animal. And then you go back to camp. And now you rest in camp for 2 or 3 or 5 days or 2 weeks, whatever it is. And then you go back out and you get stressed again. And that is sometimes described as the Paleolithic rhythm. And that makes sense. And it seems that the body can do pretty well under those conditions. But now, of course, we've got chronic stress, and not just chronic stress, but what you might call autonomic confusion. So you've got this autonomic nervous system, and it is sculpted by evolution to respond to real present moment threats on the ground in the here and now. But today you go out in a shopping mall or you go to the grocery store, pre-pandemic, and you hear music that plays, you get all these different stimuli that confuses the autonomic nervous system. And I think that's one of the reasons why people's bodies are so in so much trouble right now, because half the time we're being stimulated for fight, flight, other times to feed and breed, rest, digest. What is it? I don't know. And it's like you listen to the radio and it's a different stimuli all the time. So our bodies are really confused.
Yeah. We need the sort of the right quantities, but more important than quantity is you're saying the rhythm.
The rhythm and making it appropriate to conditions on the ground. And that's where the physical training comes in, because it reintegrates the body, and it takes what kind of gets fragmented by the modern world, and now it brings it all back together in one thing. So it's not so much a fitness thing, it's an integration thing that we're looking for.
It might explain the popularity of high intensity interval training, but that might itself become a sort of chronic stress if you get addicted and do it too often.
Right. And it's different for every person. Yeah, everybody responds differently. One man's stress might be another man's, day at the beach. So you never know.
Right. But getting back to this idea of paleo and what has kind of defined the paleo community, it's obviously many different things. There is no monolithic paleo community. And I think we would hope that there would be people who at least pick up on this logic, a trend of creating your own local community, because that's the best way for it to be experienced. So what advice would you give, or what has been your experience of creating a tribe, creating a community that can help each other in ways that go beyond just what you would traditionally think of as the workout or the gym?
Right. Well, for me, by far and away, the best environment for this kind of thing was the martial art dojo. And I just fell into that because there was a dojo near where I lived, and I just went in one day and signed up, and I loved it. And it was great, but it was a built-in community, and it had enough discipline. So there were expectations, and people trained hard to get their belts, and there was this shared experience, and it was fantastic. And I was there for quite some time before I'd even heard of personal training or the fitness industry or anything else. And it was so beneficial to me, and it was good for a lot of people. And I think it's still that way today in so many dojos around the world. So that's the model I work with. And of course, yoga studios are kind of the same way. CrossFit maybe a little bit the same way. And who knows? I mean, there's lots of ways to organize these things.
Yeah. For someone that is trying to be more relevant, and that's another word that shows up a lot in your writing, how can values sort of play into this operation with, you're starting a community, and you could take one of a few different paths. You could target your ideal customer being some particular age group, or maybe it's a sort of ideological persuasion. Or I like this music analogy. Music is one of the most culturally salient areas that we tend to cluster around. But it used to be that we didn't really have the ability to sort along these lines. Um, would you say that there is a risk of trying to get too narrow? I guess my question is, did you have an idea of the kind of community that you wanted to build when you set out to, whether it's the retreats or your writing? Have you had in mind a kind of ideal customer, or do you more just set out your values and see who comes to the table?
The latter. I put out my ideas and try to get anybody involved I can. And it's hard to recreate the dojo environment anywhere else because you need that fixed location in a neighborhood or somewhere. And to do it in a workshop setting is more difficult. But you put it out there, and I find that I'm attracting a real diversity of people. And a lot of trainers, but a lot of people in various health modalities, and older and younger. And that's exactly what I'm looking for. Because one of the problems I see also is that so many of these things get stratified by age and ability, and you don't see that much mixing. And that's what we had in the martial art dojo, is that we had old people, we had young people, we had kids, and people training across the ages. And that is fantastic because it builds community, but it also makes your body smarter because you have to interact in new ways with new people. So it's fantastic.
Right. One of the common interests that I discovered that we have is the cultural critic Ivan Illich, and I think that the role of the cultural critic has sort of gone by the wayside, or we don't have that many of these voices really speaking prominently, and it seems like we just get these boiled down options. You're either on this team, political tribe red team, or political tribe blue team. Whereas movement, it seems like, is one way to transcend that while not completely avoiding the question of politics, or at least the most pressing issues. And your writing reflects a sense of sort of urgency. Do you find that people who come to your events are there because of that sense of urgency that maybe is bleeding over from one area of concern, and they realize, hey, I might not be able to do anything at the political level, but I can still move my body and consider that ecology?
Right. Yeah. I think a lot of people who come to me are frustrated with convention, and they're looking for something else, something that is more authentically grounded in human history, because they have taken a few biology courses and they are comfortable with the idea that they are human animals, and that's okay with them. And so here now is somebody like me talking their language. So that's a fit. But Illich was huge for me. I remember reading him back in my late 20s. And he had two themes. One was about deschooling society. He was a big critic of modern education, which there's a whole subject we can go into. But his other theme was medicalization. And this, I was just really turned on when I heard about this, because when you look at how we apply, well, the most obvious example is this phrase, before beginning an exercise program, see your doctor. That's medicalization. That's taking something that is 100% natural and integral to human history and turning it into a medical problem. And that's just, from my point of view, that's just an outrageous thing to do. So I've turned it around. I said, before beginning a program of sedentary living, see your doctor.
Or
So,
before seeing your doctor, maybe try undertaking an experiment with movement or exercise.
right, and that was Illich's point. He said, look, by medicalizing everything from childbirth to exercise to aging and death, pregnancy, the whole thing, everything's medicalized now, that it tends to distract us from our own native healing powers. And we have, I mean, the whole biosphere is coursing through our bodies, and we have this immense well of healing power that we could tap into on our own, but we get distracted because we have to go to a professional for every little ache and pain. And that is, that's something we need to have a conversation about. Really.
Yeah, there was a quote that I stumbled upon of Illich's recently that I think in the context of this whole coronavirus thing is especially potent. And it was something to the effect of, the fact that good self-care is a vital component of healthcare is currently being touted as if it were some sort of new discovery or the surprising thing. And it is amazing to the extent to which we immediately rush to sort of expert solutions and technologies when in fact a lot of times they do more harm than good. So this idea of sort of medically induced illness or iatrogenesis, there was a blog post on your website, Exuberant Animal, talking about first do no medicine. That was an alternate form of but it's pretty much the idea of the Hippocratic Oath in itself.
And this connects with the paleo, because if you imagine your life in the paleo, if you go out on a hunt and you sprain your ankle, well, there's no ice, there's no braces, there's no medical expert, maybe a shaman, but that's different. So you limp your way back to camp and you rest in camp for a few days and you get better and you gradually get back on your feet. And now you've figured out how to deal with this injury on your own terms, on your own merits, and you become stronger for that. So there's something to be said. It's a reframing of injury and illness. You've got, in large measure, the power to help yourself. Let me add one more thing there. I have a friend who's a personal trainer, and we were talking about medicalization, and his take on this whole thing was, my goal is to get rid of my clients. He said, my goal is to give them the tools and the knowledge that they need to succeed, and then get rid of them so that they can go out and take care of themselves. And I thought, okay, this is great. I love this guy because he is, I think, training people in a really honest way. And it's fantastic.
Yeah, and you might think that would, in the long run, lead to not having any more customers, but I think that there's another sense in which, by being honest and offering that much value to people, you can end up with more people knocking at your door and just cycling through and maybe coming back for a refresher course every now and again.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. As opposed to a lot of the health professions where they put a lot of emphasis on business development and marketing and trying to get the repeat customers coming back and building up that dependency, which ultimately is not good for anybody except the practitioner.
Big pharma, and yeah, it's I think Illich described it as a cybernetic loop, where even though no one maybe even intentionally conceives of it this way, it ends up breeding more and more patients for the medical system. So it's this behemoth that just grows and grows and takes on a life of its own.
So this is the frightening thing, the professionalization of everything which happens, which in favor of which entire society is reorganized, which makes autonomous living impossible. But, and this is my concern is, my own curiosity goes in the direction of finding specific parameters on which one could offer resistance.
want to shift gears back to the question of tribe, and maybe talk a little bit more about what tribe means in the 21st century, where, again, we're not born into a tribe in the same way anymore. We largely get to choose it. And that is a beautiful thing in many ways, but it also gives us the option to isolate and not pick any particular tribe, or just sort of default to whichever one we are kind of born into. But with this, with loose ties, it wouldn't be the same strength of the tribe that there was even 50 or 100 years ago. So what lessons have you taken away? Again, you talked about the dojo, but even just from observing the Hadza and the Kalahari in Africa, what was the glue that kept those tribes together, and how does that translate into a modern context?
Right. Well, the paleo experience, you have to remember that that was a predator-rich environment. So you've got lions and tigers and bears, and they act to solidify the tribe. And this is one thing I realized when I went to Africa, is that you don't go walking around on your own. I mean, you don't leave camp and just go on a walkabout by yourself. It's too dangerous. So you are required in that sense to be part of a tribe. And it has a really immediate function in that sense. And it's no surprise to hear about something called Dunbar's number, where he has done this neuroscience work, and he believes that we have the capacity in the human brain to maybe handle 100 personal relationships. And so that would be the size of the optimal human tribe. And that sounds right. I mean, that matches up with other anthropology studies. The people believe that that was probably the normal human tribe. But once we exterminated the predators and started traveling more around the world, all that was just blown to hell. And so now we are free to either be in a tribe or not. And it's voluntary or forced upon us. And that's another stressor. This tribal ambiguity that we have now is incredibly difficult to navigate. And I haven't heard anybody come up with a really good idea on how to do that, because what are we supposed to have a tribe now of 7, soon to be 8 billion people? That doesn't seem to fit. That doesn't seem to work. So I don't know. In a sense, I really don't have an answer to that. I mean, you got to do the best you can. You got to work with the people in your neighborhood. You've got to work with the people in your employment, and maybe you can do a tribe that way. But it's a tough one.
I have in my notes 2 words, and I don't have the context for it, but I'm hoping that you can fill it in. Vital narrative.
Vital narrative.
What is the role of sort of storytelling in creating a community? Because I think that you're telling a story, both with Exuberant Animal is a story in a way, and you have another project, the Sapience Project, and that's sapience.earth. By the way, I want to know how you got that .earth domain. That's a pretty cool.
Yeah.
You see that out.
Well, let me back up a little bit and just say that culture and story are really 2 aspects of the same thing. And if you have a functional culture, it depends on having a functional story. And that's your roadmap. Your culture, especially in a paleo world, your culture tells you what's important. It tells you what kind of values to hold, what it means to be part of the cosmos. All of these things come through the story and the culture. And that's great. But what's happened more recently is that now our cultural narrative, especially in the West, especially with this technological civilization that we've built, it looks like our cultural narrative is coming to an end, which is to say, a lot of people now just don't believe in the dominant narrative of human supremacy and capitalism and dualism and individualism. All of that stuff is starting to wear really thin. And so I've talked to some people recently who said, we are between stories. We are between cultures. And that, I think, is another reason why people feel so much stress right now, because we can't fall back on a familiar narrative that we're used to. So we're having to make it up. And that's part of the role of the activist, I think, is to come up with a story that will resonate with other people. And that's going to be our job for the next probably 10 or 20 generations to sort it all out, to come up with a narrative that's satisfying and is cohesive for people, that brings people together. And we have a lot of work yet to do on that one.
Yeah, and this idea of, you know, future generations looking down the line. I'm actually I'm about to have a baby myself, or my wife and I are expecting a baby any day now. So this is on my mind. This idea of not just the next generation, but you write about the seventh generation, and this is a concept that might be sort of foreign to the Western mind in a way. Where does that come from?
Well, I believe it comes from the Iroquois tradition, and the idea there was that the teaching in that tribe was that the elders should not make any decision without taking into consideration the welfare of the seventh generation. And so whenever the tribal elders would get together, that was an explicit part of their governance. And contrast that with the way we operate today. Now it's all about quarterly profits and short-term thinking, and we barely even think about the next generation. So that's something where we can learn from indigenous people.
Give me some examples of that sort of thinking, both in terms of physical health, let's say, but then also an ecological perspective.
Well, I think a lot of it gets down to our obsession with speed. And this could even be traced back to, say, the 15th to 16th century and the invention of the mechanical clock. And for the first time, we started to measure the duration of various life events. And we never used to do that. Time used to be considered circular in most cultures around the world. But then all of a sudden, time became quantifiable, and clocks became ubiquitous. We saw clocks everywhere, and we started to think about time more and more. And so then that began this great acceleration in just about everything that we do now. Just about everything from commerce to sports to everything, we put a clock on it. If we don't know what to do, we can increase the excitement level if we put a clock on it and then race each other. And that's a cultural thing too, and it's very destructive. It's horrible. So that's one thing that we need to build into a new narrative is, this problem with the tortoise and the hare. We got to, the hare is not so good for us.
How do you define sapience? I'm not sure that I could have given a definition of that.
That's a great question. And there are classical definitions for this. So, for example, you go to ancient Greek, or you go to the famous philosophers of the East, and they tend to agree about things like the golden mean and balance and proportion and the importance of modesty and humility and patience. Those qualities come up over and over again. But they weren't writing and living in the midst of a planetary crisis like we are. And so I think we need to update this sapience idea a little bit. And that's what I'm trying to do with the Sapience Project, is take those traditional ideas and seeing how maybe they will fit with this ecological problem that we have. And one idea that I heard was really good from Bill McKibben, the climate activist. He said what he's seen is a confluence now. And the confluence is between modern ecological science, which the emphasis is very much on interdependence, and then native and indigenous wisdom coming together. They say basically the same thing, coming from different orientations. So that's, for me, the sapience is at that confluence. Or another way to say it is the sapience, here on my graphic, the sapience is in the circle. The health is in the circle. And that's where I like to see it. It's not in the individual. It's in the in the whole.
Yeah. What do you have coming up in terms of these events? Obviously, we're in the midst of a crisis within a crisis that I think could send us in any number of different directions. And I'm a perennial optimist in that I think that this could be an opportunity to reset our personal economies and then reflected in the decisions of a lot of people in smaller communities doing that, be reflected in the broader community, just to be more deliberate about the patterns of consumption and behavior once we start to come out of this. As we start to come out, each and every day, I've been really heartened to see more and more people outdoors in my area. I was just actually when we talked before this, I was at a little unknown beach in Berkeley that I thought was my hidden spot until recently, when it's been swarmed by people doing yoga. They're there with their kids, their dogs. The kids are actually playing in the water. And so I'm seeing these green shoots. There have been more people coming to the meetups, which we still have been doing just at a social distance. So obviously it can kind of interfere with people's travel plans and whatnot. So what's coming down the pike for you?
Well, to riff on that idea about what's possible now, a lot of people are talking about this thing called the Overton window, which is sort of a conceptual idea of what is acceptable in the realm of public discourse. And if you just go back a few months ago, things like universal health care and universal basic income, these kinds of things were considered impossible. They were outside of the Overton window. But now with the pandemic and the way that everything's scrambled now, people are starting to say, wait a minute, these are ideas that might well work. So this, in that sense, is a really good opportunity for us to maybe try some new things, new ways of living. A similar conversation I had with a fellow in Australia, an attorney who's working on the Rights of Nature project. I was talking to him right after the wildfire season. And I said, well, how are you feeling? And he says, well, I'm actually feeling kind of optimistic. And I pressed him for that. And he said, yeah, because people have gotten to the point now where they are willing to live in new ways. And that's why he was optimistic. And that's going to happen here too. So.
Yeah, I see the same possibilities with when you say new ways of living together. I think that's a great definition of culture in a sense. And there's another project, this is unrelated in a way, it's sort of a tangent, but that I've been involved with, which is called the Seasteading Institute, and this idea of seasteading or homesteading the high seas, which could take many forms. It could be the corporate megacity, or it could be small eco villages, and has brought a lot of people under an umbrella of freedom oriented. I think that the idea of sustainable aquaculture and renewable energy in a way that actually works rather than consuming more resources than it produces. These are all things that attract people to seasteading, and it allows for many different systems to be tried out, many new ways of living together to be experimented with on a smaller scale. But in the meantime, seeing things like the universal basic income as maybe sort of a transition phase where people are hopefully going to be, coming to a place where they can be supported at a local level by their community. Do you see any tension between having a sort of central institution overseeing our healthcare or a sort of kind of system of transfer payments?
Boy, I don't know, but I do have a sense in terms of governance and politics and that whole and society. Going back to the paleo, the pyramid in any given tribe was probably really low, and you had access and influence in that tribe because there might have been a tribal chief, but you would know who he was and you could go up and talk to him, and you could maybe even have some influence over that person. But with the age of agriculture, the pyramid has gotten steeper and steeper and steeper. And now anybody down at the bottom of the hierarchy has no hope of access or influence. And that's something that has to change. Somehow we've got to take that pyramid and shrink it down more to this level where people can connect with one another. And that's a big project, obviously, but it's something that's really got to happen.
More face-to-face gatherings, maybe, and in-person physical space, and the sort of embodied movement. The last conversation that I had on this podcast, the guest, Peter Ajamian, was talking about this idea of, around the time of Occupy Wall Street, a friend of his was saying, first learn to occupy yourself. And if you can comfortably inhabit your own body, then you'll be empowered to reach people, maybe not at the national level, but at least in your local area. I think that we do have much more power than we realize in our local context, and maybe less power than we realize at the federal level, where we get so much noise and fury signifying nothing.
Right. Well, I also see the role of personal trainers and body workers and health professionals. I see that in a more expansive way where they can really start taking on a leadership role, because for people who work with the body and you start asking questions about where health comes from, it becomes pretty obvious. Okay, health comes from habitat, and then that becomes part of our job description, is to preserve habitat and thereby preserve health. And I would really like to see the personal trainer community and the health professional community becoming more active in these issues, because it's not just the body. So.
Yeah, I want to just put an exclamation point on that, because I think that it really speaks to the purpose of this podcast, which is getting people to ask why they're doing what they're doing, and to clarify that sense of values in order to, one, attract more of the right kind of customer who will actually benefit from the culture and the sense of camaraderie. But beyond that is just, I think when you act from a clearer sense of purpose, it makes all of your action a little bit more truthful. And there was another slogan that caught my eye. I believe it was a Latin phrase, "in vivo veritas." You write a little bit about what is that about?
Okay, well, for people who work in the biological sciences, you've got in vitro and you've got in vivo. So in vitro, think vitreous, think glass in a beaker. That's where you study organisms in an aquarium or a petri dish, or in isolation, in vitro. But then in vivo, you study how that organism behaves in the real world. And biologists are always talking about in vitro, these are two different things. The organism is going to behave differently in these two settings. So it's very important to look at the organism in vivo to get a sense of what it likes to do and how it behaves and what makes it healthy.
And that's not to be confused with in vino veritas.
Actually, some people have said in vivo veritas, in the living there is truth. So it's like that, yeah.
I was in vino, in wine there is truth, right? And I think I don't know if it was the poet Bod, I can't remember, but there's more truth in a bottle of wine than in all the philosophy books in the world.
Yeah, maybe
something like that. But you do have an event coming up. Maybe it got postponed, I think, until September. But tell us about that. Is this an Outback trip or is it something separate?
No, this is a publisher in France that has picked up some of my work and wants me to come over. And we've got a workshop that it looks like it's all almost all filled up. But it'll be in Normandy, France, and it'll be very exciting because these are people who are hungry, and I think they're maybe a little bit frustrated and disenchanted with the conventional methods, and they want to be they want to be remembering what it's like to be a good animal again, and that's what I'm hoping to give them. So that'll be in September, and that'll be a 3-day workshop. So.
Have you been in touch with any of the Hébertists, the people following the tradition of Georges Hébert and the natural method?
A little bit, yeah. I'm friends with Erwan, and I've followed that work for a long time, and it's exciting, and I think it's very valuable, and more power to them. It's good stuff.
It's just, it seems like there's something about France and the
Yes.
culture there that maybe lets people be a little bit more free with their bodies in public. And I think about the existence of nude beaches where there's not so much of a taboo around modest nudity, which was a term that Hebert used to describe the optimal clothing for his workouts. So not completely nude, but boxer shorts, or for women, maybe maybe a sports bra or light top. And I do think that one of the barriers for me to overcome in doing MoveNet as my primary form of exercise and training is just getting comfortable being outdoors and moving freely, knowing that people might be looking at you a little bit funny.
Yeah, I had one client one time who told me, we were talking about doing movement snacks, which is an idea that I promote. It's like find ways to move wherever you are, and it could be your office, could be anywhere. And she said, well, you have to be willing to be weird, and people are going to look at you, but that's okay. You'll be all right.
I think a picture is worth 1,000 words here, and the picture that you see when you first go to your website shows, I don't know how they captured this shot, but there's a guy sort of in midair, he's holding up a ball, and it looks like you're playing some kind of game. But I'll put that in the description for the show, because if I can have your permission just to do that, because I think that it shows a little bit of what you're doing when you get together in these groups. And there's that component, and there's the intellectual component, or the lecture component. But what can people expect in a typical day of one of these workshops?
Well, a lot of fun, because the games that I've put together, these physical games, are robust, and you'll go home sore. I mean, your butt, your hamstrings, your quads will be sore, but you'll feel good. But the games are super social, and they're very unpredictable in a lot of ways. So you find yourself laughing your head off. A lot of balance and coordination games that challenge beginners, they challenge elite athletes too. And since you're working with a lot of different people, the challenge changes each time you switch partners. So that's fantastic. I mean, you really develop a sense of rapport with other people, and that's what I'm after. So super fun.
What's a movement that you've been particularly enjoying lately? Maybe a movement snack, or some kind of game, or something that people could try out at home.
One thing that I found really useful is to start out with what I call a rice paper run. So you're doing your regular running in place, but you start out as if you are on rice paper. So this is a reference back to the old martial art tradition, and it might just be legend, I don't know. But the idea that the sensei lays out the rice paper, and the test for your black belt is to walk across the rice paper without tearing it. So imagine that the rice paper's on the floor, and now you are running in place as smoothly as you possibly can, slow at first, and then building up to it. And then, of course, you can add in a million different moves and steps and everything else, but always going back to the rice paper idea. It's very valuable, and it's easy at first. I mean, you can go very slow, and then you can pick up the intensity if you really want to get sweaty. That's all fine and good, but super fun.
And just one final question. I enjoy expanding my vocabulary, and just a kind of cursory read through your website gave me a lot of new concepts that I'd never come across before. And the one that I want to ask you about as our kind of closure here is, correct me if I'm getting the pronunciation wrong, but vagility.
Agility. Yes, that's a great word. And I just encountered that maybe a year ago. And that comes from the discipline. It's kind of a new discipline called movement ecology. And this is where biologists go in and they study how much territory an animal needs to be healthy. And that might range, if you're working with antelope, it could be, 100 square miles down to smaller. And the idea here is that human vigility in the paleo was probably many square miles. And now with domestication and urbanization, that vigility has gotten smaller and smaller. And there are definitely effects to that. I mean, a lot more people now are talking about feeling incarcerated by the urban environment. And vigility is a great word to use when you talk about those kinds of things.
It echoes Ivan Illich too in talking about the formula of, schooling makes us stupider, healthcare makes us sicker, and all these advances in transportation technology have counterintuitively boxed us in, and we can't even walk as far as we used to be able to, because you'd be, walking along the freeway, and who wants to do that, surrounded by all this pollution and garbage or whatever it is that we've trashed our environment with. It's a great thought experiment. Again, to bring it, consider humans as animals that have requirements that are supposed advances in civilization have actually sort of stripped us of. So Frank, thanks so much for taking the time. Are there any kind of closing comments or things about tribe, values, vigility, vivo veritas, a lot of V's there?
Right. Well, I would just say that you're probably, in speaking to people generally, I say, you're probably a lot stronger than you think you are. And we've been duped into this narrative that we need all this expert help. But really, what we've got is this case of amnesia. We've forgotten our roots. We've forgotten the deep primal heritage in our bodies, and we've forgotten how strong we are. So the fundamental thing we have to do now is remember. And that's the role of the trainer, the coach, the therapist, the health professional. Help people remember. And it's there. The more you focus on that, the more it will grow, and the more you will feel the deep, ancient nature of your body. And that's incredibly powerful.
Wise words, and spoken like a true, exuberant, and enlightened, I may add, animal. Not just the lower animal nature, but also bringing in the wisdom of tradition.
Well, wonderful. I really appreciate you having me on, and I look forward to meeting you one day. I'm sure I'll be coming down to California at some point. I was going to make a road trip this month, actually, and of course I canceled that, but maybe October or thereabouts I'll be making another road trip, and so I'll definitely look you up.
Excellent. Well, you're always welcome, and even if California ends up seceding from the rest of the nation, I feel like we're going to end up taking Oregon with us, so okay. We'll be in the same corridor.
Take care.
Hey, if you're not thinking about the cultural component of your gym or personal training practice, you are missing out on one of the best opportunities to find your ideal customer. In addition to getting weekly links of the best fitness-related content from around the web, you'll also get access to our exclusive library of full interviews. And if that's not enough, we're giving away a free workbook to help you attract the perfect customer by figuring out why you do what you do. Join the Culture Club today and get started on your mission.
Diary had a request. Do this 3 counts, clap in. And kind of a wide stance. Right hand, left hand, jump. Now when you come down, you got to turn it around. So now it's left hand, right hand, jump. Right, left, jump. Right, jump. Right, left, jump. Left, right, jump. Like so.
see that I have talked longer than I wanted to. So let me sum up the end somewhat shorter than I had planned, because we want to come into conversation. I believe that if we apply the hypothesis of the two modes of production and of negative synergy which sets in when one mode outgrows the balance to the agricultural production of food, we would need to find some parameters according to which we can define when agricultural production, inevitably mechanized production, must become counterproductive. I have played around and would like, during the seminar in Cuernavaca this year, to discuss two hypotheses. One would be to figure out what percentage of the total food value needed in a large population passes the market, which is also a measurement of the degree to which the population as a whole is cut out of all contributions they can make towards the production of their food. And the second one would be a measurement which is so much up in the air that exactly I wanted to present it to you, John Turner, and some other friends here as a hypothesis. It seems to me as crazy today to mention it as it seemed to us crazy in Cuernavaca to speak about speed limits in transportation as a critical parameter in the building up of transportation systems. And it is the following. Agriculture all through history was provided a positive energy balance. If you looked at the total energy which resulted from agricultural Neolithic and post-Neolithic production, you got more energy, that is, more food energy, food calories out of the land than you put into it except for burning. With mechanization, agriculture has become a negative activity. Inevitably, you put many more calories in form of, to simplify it, gasoline into the production process than you get out. I wondered if one could not develop a measurement which would designate the mechanical calorie content of a food calorie delivered on the consumer's table, which includes not only the cost of mechanical working of the field, chemical fertilizing, but also the cost of treatment and transportation, and thereby, on a rather global level, be able to make arrive at some kind of conclusions about the level beyond which food overloaded with mechanical energy becomes globally destructive.